In this new series, The Eternal Purpose, we'll walk through the opening chapters of the book Ultimate Intention by DeVern Fromke, where he exposes our man-centered gospel and calls us back to the Father's original before, his ultimate plan in Christ, and reminds us that everything depends on starting from the right point, the Father himself. In episode 1, we prayed the prayer with Billy's dad, Father, help me to understand. And we saw that if we only look at the dots and the lines, the after of sin and failure, we'll miss the white background, the before of the Father's eternal purpose. And today we're in chapter 2, the proper starting point, where Fromke shows us that where you begin shapes where you end. And my great friend Daniel Dunn, who leads the Polish School of the 70, he once used this illustration, which he probably took from somewhere else, but it's stuck with me ever since I first heard this, that if you were launching a rocket to the moon and your calculations were off by even a single degree, you'd miss the moon entirely. And one small mistake at the starting line creates a massive miss at the finish line. And I've lived like that for years, just 1 degree off, and it meant that I was missing the Father's real intention. Because if we start in the wrong place, the whole thing bends out of shape. Whereas if we start in the right place, everything comes into focus. And so most of us have been trained to start the story of God in Genesis chapter 3 with sin. And Fromke writes, and I quote, "Too often human history has been interpreted from the full. If this is the starting point, it is natural that all history would have a redemptive coloring. God's purpose is then seen in the light of man's need for redemption." And if that's where we begin, the whole Bible becomes a repair manual. God is reduced to a fixer, and life is framed as patching up what's broken. As Fromke says, if you start with the full, you can only end with man's restoration. And the story keeps circling around our failure and our repair. And this is why so much preaching is stuck on cycles of sin, forgiveness, and trying again, because it never truly matures the sons. It's like starting a road trip with the wrong map. No matter how well planned you think you are and sincere you are, you keep circling the wrong towns and you never reach the true destination. And so starting here with the full makes the gospel really, really small. Salvation becomes little more than sin management, but Paul points us beyond this. Ephesians 1:4, even as he chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world. Before sin ever appeared, the Father already had his plan. And for those of you who have been in and around this message for a while, you will hear this phrase, Plan A is still on. And so if you start here, where Paul starts, where the Father starts, you don't end up with man, you end up with sons. Others pick up Genesis 1:28 as their starting point, which says, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it." And so this is man's task, his dominion mandate. And if this is the starting point, the story becomes all about man's responsibility and failure to carry it out. And the end is always frustration. Adam didn't fulfill it, Israel didn't fulfill it, and we end up measuring ourselves by whether we can succeed where others have failed. And the whole focus stays on man's ability, or should I say inability, rather than the Father's desire. And so if this is your starting point, the gospel feels like pressure. It's about what we must accomplish for God, rather than what the Father has purposed in his Son. And the Christian life turns into endless striving to fulfill a mandate instead of resting in the Father's purpose. And so starting here makes our commission the centerpiece, but the centerpiece has always been Christ. And some people go back to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. And that sounds right. And of course, it's true. But even if we start here, we can miss the point. If you start with God as creator only, you end with power, majesty, and awe, but no intimacy and oneness. You end up with a God who is sovereign but distant, a maker but not necessarily a father. And Paul never stopped at creator. He pushed us to see God as Father. And Fromke explains, and I quote, Paul always started back in the heart of the eternal Father before the foundation of the world. God's vital fatherhood is seen to be the controlling and ultimate factor which determines all his activities. And so, if you start with God as creator, you marvel at his handiwork, but you may miss his heart because creation shows his power, but it doesn't show his desire. And so, starting here leaves you with majesty, but it doesn't leave you with intimacy and closeness. When you start with the Father, everything changes because you end with his family. That's where all of the other strands, creation, redemption, commission, they find their place and their meaning. The purpose was never just a world or a people with a task or even a redeemed group. It was always sons sharing the life, the love, the faith, and the likeness of the Father through the Son. And some of us shift the focus of the cross itself and make that the whole story. And Fromke warns, and I quote, redemption is a parenthesis, not the main thesis. The vital fatherhood of God is the controlling factor in history and the consummating reality in eternity. And don't misunderstand me, redemption is essential. Without it, we are lost, but it is not ultimate. Redemption is the doorway, not the destination. And if you make it the destination, you camp at the doorway and you never move into the Father's house. You stay at the point of rescue and never discover the reason you were rescued, to be brought into sonship, into the Father's family, into his eternal purpose. So what happens if you start here? Well, the Christian life becomes about staying forgiven, avoiding hell, and waiting for heaven. You live grateful but still small, and you never see the vast intention of the Father to bring many sons into glory, Hebrews 2:10. And Fromke really presses this point. God never intended the redemptive phase to overshadow his eternal purpose. The cross clears the way, but the goal was always family. Fromke quotes Watchman Nee, and I quote, there was something in God's mind before the fall, and in the ages to come, the thing is to be fully realized. God knew all about sin and redemption, yet in his great purpose for the church, set forth in Genesis 2, there is no view of sin. It is as though he leaps right over the whole story of redemption and sees the church in future eternity having a ministry and a history which is altogether apart from sin and is wholly of God. You see, redemption is vital, but it is not the final destination. And so before anything was created, before sin ever showed up, the Father already had a plan in his heart. And I quote Fromke, it was this purpose, which had previously been a mystery, that the Apostle Paul was now unveiling. The Father intended for his Son to have a body to express his life, himself in the world now, and before all creation in the ages to come. We must cease interpreting God's purpose and plan in the light of the fall. This, which we see in Ephesians, is what the Father intended to realize in his Son, and it has never been affected by sin, the fall, or time. And so this is the ultimate starting point. The Father wanted a family of sons, a people who would share his life, his love, and his likeness. And Paul captures it in Ephesians 1, chosen in Christ, accepted in the beloved, all things summed up in him. Everything else, creation, commission, redemption, only makes sense when we see this. So what happens if we start here? Well, the gospel stops being about fixing problems or keeping rules. It becomes about the Father's delight in the Son and our place in Him. And you realize your life is caught up in something so much bigger than forgiveness or duty. It's about being part of the Father's eternal pleasure in His Son. And this shift moves us from a man-centered outlook to a God-centered one. Instead of asking, what does this do for me? The question becomes, what does this mean for the Father? And that's the question that really lies at the center of everything. Because yes, this is what the Father is after. His delight in His Son and sons who share the same life and love. And so the difference here is between the gospel orbiting around man and a gospel centered in the Father. And so here's the question I want to leave you with today. Where do you start the story of God? Because if you begin with man, his fall, his need, his restoration, you'll always circle back to man as the center. But if you begin with the Father, his desire, his purpose, his eternal plan, then you end up with his family of sons sharing his life, his likeness, and his love. And that is the proper starting point. And so I encourage you to go and listen to chapter 2 being read on Tent Talk. And join me next time as we move into the next chapter, chapter 3, One Ultimate Theme. And in this chapter, Fromke shows us how all the different strands of creation, providence, government, redemption, sanctification are only parts. None of them is the whole chord. They only make sense when woven together in the Father's one ultimate theme, His eternal purpose in His Son.